Hello and welcome. It is often said that Pakistan is the only country where the army owns the nation rather than nation controlling the army. But Pakistan's all-weather friend and India's other adversary, China, goes one step further. In fact, the Chinese People's Liberation Army is not the army of the nation, but is army of the Communist Party of China, or CPC. That's the subject of this week's Simply Nitin. I'm Nitin Gokhale. So the PLA, which has been in the news in India more often than not in the past 1 year or so, since May 2020, when it tried to ingress into eastern Ladakh across the line of actual control, and then invited huge response, quick response from the Indian military, which resulted in a longish, in fact, the longest standoff between the two military forces ever since the two have been clashing on the line of actual control or along the border, which is undemarcated and not settled between the two Asian giants. So the PLA has a longer history than many people think. Although China became the People's Republic of China in 1949, to be precise, on 1st October 1949, the People's Liberation Army came into being as early as 1927 and was formalized into the military formations by the Communist Party of China in 1929 or thereabouts. So the People's Liberation Army then was truly the People's Liberation Army. It was involved in the Long March. It was first retreating against the nationalist forces in China, and then later started turning the tables before it came to power in 1949. Since then, the PLA has undergone almost a dozen odd uh, reforms and reorganizations and modernizations. But nothing is as significant as the modernization that was unleashed in 2016, or at least announced in 2016, although it had started as early as 2012 under President Xi Jinping, who is also the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao, Mao Zedong, or the supreme leader of China from 1949 till his death in the early 70s, had always said that the PLA is there to serve the interest of the CPC and not interest of the nation or interest of the people. He always believed that the power, political power, flowed out of the barrel of the gun and used the PLA accordingly. It is no different even today, except the fact that the PLA is a modernized force and it is no longer as big as it was in the days of Mao or even Deng Xiaoping. Today, the PLA is trying to become a lean and mean force. It is trying to catch up with the modern trends, and in fact, it is perhaps the fastest growing military in the world in terms of the naval force it is accumulating for itself to keep Chinese assets protected and secured. But going back to the structure of the PLA is controlled by what is called the Central Military Commission, which is headed by the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, in this case, President Xi Jinping, who is the General Secretary. And the professional soldiers do the operational part or do operational planning and execution, while the political inputs into the leadership, called political commissars or political commissars, are the ones who give direction, political direction to the soldiers. They are in charge, these political commissars are in charge of indoctrination and propaganda. The average Chinese soldier is not our typical Indian soldier who only knows how to fight, be disciplined, be part of a force that has different sets of ethos, which is different from the civilian population. The Chinese soldier, per force, has to be a member of the CPC, that is the Chinese Communist Party. The commissars indoctrinate them, allow them to understand and learn the importance of propaganda, and only the professional soldiers who have been trained as professional soldiers and officers do the operational part or the execution of the operational directives. Those directives come from the CMC, and the CMC is the all-powerful body which gives out doctrines, it gives out operational directives, and which also allocate resources and assets to the PLA. The CMC is responsible for policy, for higher direction of war, and of course the doctrine. The Chinese PLA, or the People's Liberation Army, of course has the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, but they're not called Navy and the Air Force in the way that we in India call them, the Indian Air Force, Indian Navy. There they are called, the Chinese Air Force, for instance, is called the PLA Air Force, or PLAF, People's Liberation Army Air Force, or People's Liberation Army Navy. That means PLAN and PLAF. They are the uh, part of the five main organs of the PLA. One is, of course, the PLA Ground Forces, that is PLA GF, PLA Air Force, and PLA Navy. So PLA GF, PLA Navy or PLAN, and PLAF are the three main components of the PLA as a whole. The fourth component is the rocket force, which is basically the strategic forces controlling and countering nuclear battle or nuclear war. They control the nuclear arsenal of China. They also are equipped to counter any nuclear attack on China. Fifth component is called the strategic support force. It basically looks after cyber, space, and electronic warfare. Now, that's the way the PLA as a whole is organized. Since 2012, when President Xi Jinping decided that the Chinese army needed to be modernized and reorganized, there have been several changes that have happened. One of the biggest changes has been that the number of soldiers in the PLA across the five components that I mentioned were cut down by about 100,000 or 1 lakh soldiers, foot soldiers. So they were demobilized and they were given a lump sum amount when they left the military or the PLA since 2012. That's a separate discussion actually, where there are a lot of social issues that have uh, arisen out of the demobilization of so many soldiers. But we are not getting into that right now. One of the biggest reorganization steps that the Chinese PLA took after 2012 and started implementing it in 2016 was to reorganize the entire country or the entire structure of the PLA into five theatre commands: Eastern Theatre Command, Western Theatre Command, Central Theatre Command, Northern Theatre Command, and Southern Theatre Command. Now, these theatre commands combine all these five elements that we spoke about: PLAF, PLAN, the Strategic Support Force, and the Rocket Force, apart from the PLAGF, that is the ground forces or the conventional army. They are all integrated, they are training jointly, they have evolved their doctrines and their concepts jointly. And since 2016, China has decided that it will only go the joint way as far as war fighting is concerned. So therefore, these five theatre commands were announced in early 2016, and slowly they have been implemented. What do these theatre commands do? As I said, they combine all the elements of military power and evolve their concepts and doctrines to implement or employ them in battlefield. China, of course, also believes in standoff weapons and standoff warfare, where non-contact warfare is the main element in their doctrine and concepts, which means they will depend on missiles, they will depend on rockets, they'll depend on long-range vectors, as they're called, artillery, and bombing the enemy from long distance. So non-contact warfare, that is one of the major concepts in this new reorganization and modernization of the PLA. The Western Theatre Command and the Eastern Theatre Command are the main theatre commands which have all the muscle power as far as the PLA is concerned. Why is that? The Eastern Theatre Command, as the name denotes, looks after the Taiwan Straits. One of the major elements of Chinese military power which will be employed if push comes to shove, and if China wants to reunite Taiwan with mainland China, will come in Taiwan Straits. And the Chinese first objective of their military power or employing their military power is Taiwan and not India. That must be understood. With India, they will continue to do the salami slicing, they will continue to do the coercion, they'll continue to do what is called the creeping forward tactics, as they have been doing for a number of years now with India, for decades, in fact. But they are not, at least for now, showing any signs of an all-out war with India. But with Taiwan, that is not the case. So the Eastern Theater Command, in a way, is the biggest and the most important theater command as far as China and the CPC is concerned. The next important theater command is the Western Theater Command, which borders the entire border with India, and also, of course, with smaller nations like Bhutan, Nepal, Afghanistan, and through that illegally ceded territory with Pakistan. So, Eastern and Western Theater Commands get maximum assets. The Western Theater Command, in fact, in terms of geographical size, is the biggest theater command in the Chinese scheme of things. It looks after, as I said, the Tibet military region. It looks after the Xinjiang military region, and of course borders the entire undemarcated LAC and the McMahon line with India. Now, the Western Theatre Command has been in the news in India for a long time, since in fact 2012, 2013, when they started pushing their agenda of uh, pushing the LAC in Eastern Ladakh westward. As we all know, throughout the past 12 months, I've been talking about it. And of course, claiming the whole of Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. And of course, as we did, I think, just in the last 10 days, how they are pressurizing tiny Bhutan to settle the boundary, to establish diplomatic relations. All that is part of Western Theatre Command's military coercion tactics with India, with Bhutan, and with other smaller countries like Nepal. That's where these theatre commands are important. And the PLA, of course, is a vast military force. It's an interesting history, or a very checkered history it has, since China became the People's Republic of China in 1949. Within a year of becoming the People's Republic of China, China joined the war in Korea. In fact, it was untested. It wanted to prevent the Americans from being in that part of the region. And it went on for a couple of years. Of course, the Americans went back. The Chinese forced a stalemate there, and they, of course, retreated after that very quickly. Then the next battle they fought was with the USSR in the late 60s. Several small skirmishes and one battle of Usuri on the Usuri River, in fact, in 1969. And then, of course, the 1979 war with Vietnam. Now, the Chinese PLA has been modernized, it has been provided modern weapons, it's got excellent communication facilities, it is employing IW, as it is called, information warfare. In fact, one of the big changes that came into the Chinese thinking was after the first Gulf War in 1991, when the Chinese realized that they have to fight local wars under informationized conditions. That means the battlefield transparency, where one can see battles happening sitting in the headquarters, because of the net-centric warfare that was evolving in those years, with the US employing all its might in the Gulf War that time. Since then, the PLA has tried to keep up with the modern trend. It has got good backing in terms of budget, in terms of research, and it is trying to modernize itself. So, what is the weakness that the PLA might have? The entire PLA. I'm not just talking about the ground forces, but the entire PLA that was shown up in Galwan in June 2020. The PLA soldiers are combat inexperienced. Compare them with Indian soldiers who are combat experienced, combat hardened, because of the peculiar circumstances under which they operate in Jammu and Kashmir, in the northeast, For years together, they have been fighting insurgencies. They have been fighting in the jungles, in various different terrains, like the high altitude in Siachen, high altitude in Jammu and Kashmir, high altitude in Arunachal Pradesh or Sikkim. The Chinese average soldier hasn't had much battle experience or real time battle experience. After 1979, it was for the first time in 2020 that there was blood spilled of the Chinese soldier in Galwan. Now, that is something that the Chinese society, the Chinese government, and the Chinese military is not yet ready. They're not ready for body bags. Unlike the Indian psyche, where we tend to lose because of the cross border terrorism encouraged by Pakistan in Jammu and Kashmir and some of the insurgencies that are fought in the northeast, India tends to lose on an average about 100 soldiers in these insurgencies and counterinsurgency operations. Whereas in China, bloodshed or killing of soldiers or soldiers laying down their lives is rare. Therefore, Galwan actually created a huge ripple in the Chinese society. And even today, the Chinese haven't fully acknowledged the sacrifices or the killing of number of soldiers on their side. While they acknowledge 4 deaths so far, the number is anything between 40 and 45 killed in the Galwan clash. But the Chinese are known not to acknowledge deaths of their soldiers on battlefield. In fact, it was not before 1994 that the Chinese acknowledged the deaths of their soldiers in the 1962 war with India. In India, India is a democracy, it's an open society. Soldiers killing can never be, or a death of a soldier in action, killing of a soldier in an action can never be hidden, given the systems that we follow. In China, it has so far been the practice that they don't immediately acknowledge, they are reluctant to acknowledge sacrifices and deaths of their soldiers. That's the difference between professional armies like India or the United States or the UK and the army of the party, the PLA, where the prestige of the party comes uppermost rather than the life of a soldier. And that is the difference that was shown up in Galwan when a pre planned attack by the Chinese on the Indian group of soldiers who had gone across to discuss the disengagement resulted in that bloody clash. And the Chinese were surprised by the ferocious counter attack launched by the Indian soldiers after being caught unawares and by surprise by the initial pre-planned Chinese attack. Now that's where PLA is seen to be lacking: combat experience, hardiness, and initiative. Now we'll see how the Chinese evolve, because President Xi Jinping has a big plan for the country, for the Chinese Communist Party, as well as the PLA. By 2049, Xi Jinping and the CPC wants China to be the most preeminent power, both militarily and economically. They are systematically working towards it, but the structure that I mentioned is geared towards what is called very well coordinated standoff battles or non contact warfare. Whether that warfare will take them very far or not, we'll see. And whether the Chinese have the stomach for a fight and for bloodshed will have to be seen. Otherwise, on paper, the Chinese have a formidable military, and everyone, including India, will have to be wary of their modernization, their reorganization, and their reforms that they're carrying out for almost the past decade now. That's all I had this time to share with you. For almost a year now, I've been talking about how Indian Army, Indian military has reorganized itself, how reoriented itself to take on the main challenge from the Chinese. We have spoken enough that 2020 and 2021 is not 1962, and therefore we need not fear the Chinese. We need not think of them. Indian soldiers no longer think of the Chinese soldiers as 10 feet tall and um, empowered with supernatural powers. But it is always important to know how the adversary functions, what are its plans, and therefore I thought I will just give you a small glimpse of how the Chinese PLA is organized and what has been its history since 1949. That's all I have this week. Do keep watching Simply Nitin and of course StratNews Global. You know our social media handles, you know our YouTube channel. Do subscribe, do support us, and of course follow us and give us feedback. We will come back with more such episodes. Until the next time, it's goodbye.